What if I told you that retirement was supposed to be about fishing trips and grandkids, not chasing down leads that could get you killed? My name is Frank Morrison, and after 35 years wearing a badge, I thought I'd hung up my detective hat for good. But sometimes, the job finds you when you least expect it. And what happened to me 6 months into my retirement changed everything I thought I knew about letting go. Picture this. It's a Tuesday morning in September, and I'm sitting on my back porch in suburban Phoenix, sipping my third cup of coffee and watching the neighbor's cat terrorize the local bird population. The biggest decision on my agenda was whether to trim the hedges or finally tackle that leaky faucet Martha had been asking me to fix for 3 months. Life was predictable, quiet, and honestly, a little boring. Then my phone rang. Now, most retired folks would let it go to voicemail. But once a cop, always a cop. The number wasn't one I recognized, but something about the timing felt off. It was 7:23 a.m., too early for telemarketers, too late for emergencies that couldn't wait until business hours. The voice on the other end was shaky, belonged to an elderly woman who introduced herself as Eleanor Patterson. She lived about 15 minutes from my house, and she was convinced someone was watching her home. Not breaking in, not vandalizing, just watching, for 3 weeks straight. I should have told her to call the police. That's what any reasonable person would do. But there was something in her voice, a tremor that reminded me of victims I'd worked with over the decades. Fear has a sound, and Eleanor Patterson was terrified. Against my better judgment, I found myself in my car 20 minutes later, driving to her address on Maple Street. The house was a modest ranch-style home with a well-maintained garden in one of those neighborhoods where people still leave their doors unlocked. As I pulled into her driveway, I noticed something immediately. Perfect sight lines from at least 3 different vantage points across the street. Eleanor met me at the door, and I could see why she was scared. She was maybe 75, lived alone since her husband passed 2 years ago, and had that vulnerable look that makes some people targets. But she was sharp, observant, and when she started describing what she'd noticed, my old instincts kicked in hard. She'd first noticed the surveillance 3 weeks prior. A different car each time, always parked with a clear view of her front door. The occupants never got out, never approached the house, but they were always there during specific windows. Early morning between 7 and 9, late afternoon between 4 and 6, and sometimes late at night around 11. What made it more unsettling was the precision. These weren't random occurrences or paranoid delusions. Eleanor had started keeping a log, complete with license plate numbers, car descriptions, and times. She'd documented 17 separate incidents across 3 weeks, and the pattern was unmistakable. I spent an hour with her, reviewing her notes and checking the sight lines myself. Eleanor wasn't imagining things. Someone was conducting surveillance on her home, and they were being professional about it. The question was why a retired widow would be worth this level of attention. Eleanor insisted she had no enemies, no valuable possessions, and no reason anyone would want to watch her. She'd been a librarian for 40 years, volunteered at the local animal shelter, and her biggest excitement was her weekly bridge game with 3 other women from the neighborhood. On the surface, she was the last person you'd expect to be under surveillance. But I'd learned long ago that surface appearances mean nothing. Everyone has secrets, and sometimes those secrets catch up with you when you least expect it. I told Eleanor I'd look into it, though I wasn't sure exactly what that meant. I was retired, had no official authority, and technically should have just called this in to the local precinct. But something about the whole situation felt personal, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. That night, I did something I hadn't done in 6 months. I conducted surveillance of my own. I parked 3 blocks away and walked through the neighborhood, taking note of every vehicle, every person, every detail that seemed out of place. At 11:15 p.m., a dark sedan pulled up across from Eleanor's house and sat there for exactly 47 minutes before driving away. I managed to get a partial plate number and a decent description of the vehicle. The next morning, I called in a favor from an old colleague who was still active. Within 2 hours, I had a registration that led to a rental company, and that led to a credit card that belonged to someone named Marcus Chen. Here's where things got interesting. Marcus Chen was a private investigator based out of Los Angeles, specializing in insurance fraud and background investigations. He had a clean record, legitimate business, and absolutely no obvious connection to Eleanor Patterson. But someone had hired him to watch her, and that someone was paying good money for professional surveillance. I spent the next 3 days digging into Eleanor's background, and what I found changed everything. Eleanor Patterson wasn't just a retired librarian. 45 years ago, she'd been Eleanor Morrison, married to a man named Robert Morrison, who'd been involved in a series of armed robberies in California before disappearing with over $200,000 in cash. The name Morrison got my attention for obvious reasons, but it was more than just a coincidence. Eleanor had been questioned extensively by police at the time, but was never charged. She'd claimed ignorance about her husband's activities, divorced him in absentia, and moved to Arizona to start over. She'd been 28 years old and had never remarried. But here's the thing about cold cases. They never really die. Robert Morrison's body was never found, the money was never recovered, and there were always theories about what really happened. Some investigators believed he'd been killed by his partners. Others thought he'd fled to Mexico. But a few suspected that Eleanor knew more than she'd ever admitted. When I confronted Eleanor with this information, her reaction told me everything I needed to know. She didn't deny it, didn't act surprised, and didn't try to convince me I was wrong. She just looked tired, like she'd been carrying a heavy weight for 45 years and was finally ready to put it down. The truth was more complicated than anyone had guessed. Eleanor had known about Robert's crimes, but she'd also been a victim of them. He'd been abusive, controlling, and had threatened to kill her if she ever left or went to the police. When he disappeared, she'd been relieved, terrified, and completely alone. But Robert Morrison hadn't disappeared. He'd been murdered by his partners, and Eleanor had witnessed it. She'd been too scared to come forward at the time, had convinced herself that staying quiet was the only way to survive, and had spent 4.5 decades looking over her shoulder. The surveillance wasn't about the money or Robert's crimes. It was about inheritance. Robert Morrison had a son from a previous marriage, a son who'd grown up believing his father had abandoned him. That son was now a successful businessman in his 60s, and he'd recently learned about his father's death through a private investigator he'd hired to find closure. But Marcus Chen had discovered something else during his investigation. Before Robert Morrison died, he'd hidden the stolen money, and there was evidence suggesting Eleanor knew where it was. The son wasn't interested in justice or closure anymore. He wanted his inheritance, and he was willing to be patient to get it. The surveillance was psychological warfare. The son knew that eventually the pressure would get to Eleanor, and she'd either lead them to the money or make contact with someone who could. It was a long game, but one that was already showing results. Eleanor was stressed, isolated, and starting to make mistakes. When I explained this to Eleanor, she broke down. Not because she'd been caught, but because she'd been carrying the burden of that secret for so long. She told me about the night Robert died, about the money he'd hidden, and about the guilt she'd felt for never coming forward. The money was still hidden, buried in a location that only Eleanor knew. Over the years, she'd thought about retrieving it, about turning it over to police, about doing something with information that felt like a poison inside her. But she'd always been too scared, too worried about the consequences of admitting she'd lied for so long. Here's where my retirement got really interesting. I had a choice to make. I could turn this over to the proper authorities, let the system handle it, and walk away clean. That would have been the smart play, the safe play, the play that wouldn't complicate my golden years. But I looked at Eleanor Patterson, saw a woman who'd been victimized her entire adult life, and decided that sometimes justice is more important than procedure. I was going to help her end this, once and for all. Working with Eleanor, we developed a plan. We would recover the money, turn it over to the authorities, and force the son to face the truth about his father's death. But we had to be careful. Marcus Chen was still conducting surveillance, and we couldn't afford to tip him off before we were ready. The money was buried in the desert outside Phoenix, in a location that Robert Morrison had chosen specifically because it was isolated and unlikely to be developed. Eleanor had been there once, 45 years ago and had memorized every detail of the location because she'd known this day would eventually come. We went out on a Saturday morning, early enough to avoid the heat, but late enough that the desert would be empty. Eleanor guided us to a spot about 50 yards from a distinctive rock formation, and after 2 hours of careful digging, we found a metal box containing $187,000 in cash. The money was wrapped in plastic, preserved by the dry desert air, and still bore the bank bands from the original robbery. It was evidence, proof of crimes committed almost half a century ago, and it was going to change everything for Eleanor Patterson. But our recovery mission hadn't gone unnoticed. Marcus Chen had been watching Eleanor's house, had seen us leave together, and had followed us to the desert. He'd witnessed the entire recovery and had photographed everything from a distance. When we returned to Eleanor's house, Marcus Chen was waiting for us. He wasn't alone. Robert Morrison's son was with him, and they wanted to talk. The conversation was tense but civil. The son, whose name was David Morrison, didn't want the money for himself. He wanted closure, wanted to understand what had happened to his father, and wanted to finally put the questions to rest. The money was secondary to the truth. Eleanor told David the complete story. Everything she'd witnessed, everything she'd hidden, everything she'd been too scared to say for 45 years. She described how Robert Morrison had died, who had killed him, and why she'd been too terrified to come forward. David listened without interruption, and when Eleanor finished, he did something unexpected. He thanked her, not for hiding the truth, but for finally telling it. He'd spent his entire life wondering about his father, creating stories and theories about why he'd been abandoned. The truth was ugly, but it was better than the uncertainty. We turned the money over to the Phoenix Police Department the next day. Eleanor gave a full statement about the events from 45 years ago, and while the statute of limitations had long since expired, the information helped close several cold cases and brought closure to other families who'd been affected by Robert Morrison's crimes. The surveillance stopped immediately. David Morrison returned to California with answers he'd been seeking his entire life, and Eleanor Patterson was finally free from a secret that had been controlling her life for decades. But the story doesn't end there. 3 months later, Eleanor received a letter from David Morrison. He'd used his resources to research the families of Robert Morrison's victims, and he'd made donations to help families who were still struggling with the financial impact of those crimes committed so long ago. Eleanor decided to sell her house and move to a retirement community in Sedona. She said she wanted to be around people again, wanted to stop looking over her shoulder, wanted to finally live the life she'd been too scared to live for 45 years. As for me, I learned something important about retirement. You can take the detective out of the job, but you can't take the job out of the detective. Sometimes the most important cases are the ones that find you when you're not looking for them. I still live in Phoenix, still drink too much coffee, and still haven't fixed that leaky faucet. But I sleep better at night knowing that Eleanor Patterson is finally free, and that sometimes, even in retirement, you get the chance to make a difference in someone's life. The experience taught me that justice doesn't have an expiration date, and that sometimes the most important investigations are the ones that help people find peace with their past. Eleanor Patterson spent 45 years carrying someone else's secrets, and helping her find freedom from that burden was worth coming out of retirement for. If you're wondering whether I'd do it again, the answer is absolutely. Because sometimes the job isn't about the badge or the authority or the official capacity. Sometimes it's just about helping people when they need it most, and that's a calling that doesn't end when you turn in your badge. So that's my story about retirement, about second chances, and about the cases that matter most. Sometimes the biggest mysteries aren't about who committed the crime, but about how to find the courage to finally tell the truth.